You don't believe in moral relativism. Let's talk about why. The 20th century saw more violent human death than any other in all history by more than double. Even as a percentage of population, the 20th exceeded any other century. In all of this backstabbing and butchery, was any of it actually wrong? I will provide 3 distinct lines of reasoning in opposition to normative moral relativism. In order to avoid a straw man, it is necessary to define the most prominent alternative in ethical theory, moral objectivism. Moral objectivism does not claim that the right answer is the same in each circumstance, but rather that for each circumstance there is a right answer. This right answer exists whether human beings are aware of it, like it, or agree with it. Normative moral relativism doesn't simply claim that different people hold different views, this is hardly controversial, but claims that among those views there is never an objective right answer. Logos. Moral relativism asserts that there are no moral absolutes. In other words, there are absolutely 0 moral absolutes. Since this statement itself is an absolute moral claim, it is clearly self-contradictory. Moral relativism tries to cover this self-contradiction through a slightly more covert argument that premise 1, all moral viewpoints are equally valid. However, this must be quickly followed by premise 2, claims that oppose premise 1 are not valid, else moral objectivism could be justified as a valid viewpoint. That would be the contradiction of moral relativism, leading to the odd conclusion, therefore not all moral viewpoints are equally valid. Since the conclusion refutes one of its own premises, the argument is a contradiction as well. In summary, under moral relativism, there are absolutely 0 absolutes, and all views are valid, and not all views are valid. Ethos. Ethos is the argument from authority. If moral relativism is true, there is no ethical authority. Ethics is the study of what we ought to do. In a world in which people decide their own ethics, there is no ought in a moral sense. Ought would be no different from I justify it because I want it. There is a term for a system in which each person is his or her own ultimate authority. It's called anarchy. Thus, if ethics is the study of this concept of ought, which although pretended does not actually exist, ethics is an illusion. It is a means for human beings to control other human beings, nothing more. Surely it is a confusing world in which we navigate our lives by an illusion that we don't even believe in, and it should come as no surprise that such a nonsensical world would produce nonsensical actions. Is it any wonder, then, that out of this ethically anarchistic moral vacuum, we are seeing an increasing number of heinous, motiveless mass murders? We do all we can to tell people there are no rules, and then we are surprised when, after finding this world vapid of meaning and purpose, some choose to break the rules that we told them didn't exist in the first place. Sound confusing? It should. It's ethical anarchy. In summary, under relativism, ethics is an illusion. Relativism is ethical anarchy, and a moral vacuum leads to violence. Pathos. Moral relativism leads to some frightening conclusions which we'd rather not face. My comments here will probably make some uncomfortable. My hope is that, in addition to being discomforting, it proves thought-provoking. Moral relativism must conclude that slavery is not really wrong. Not only that, but those who bought, sold, and beat slaves were actually right to do it because they were following the norms of their culture. If morality is relative, then something like slavery may be unfashionable today, in the same category as wearing stripes on plaids, but we couldn't say it is actually wrong. Moral relativism must conclude that the Holocaust was not wrong. Hitler and the Nazis were just following the ethics of the culture they created. But it gets worse. Not only does relativism conclude that the Nazis weren't wrong in the 1940s, but if the Nazis were in power today, the relativist could not justify opposing them, because again, they would just be following the ethics of their culture. And worse still, to believe that the true arbiter of ethics is one's culture is to believe that should 51% of Americans decide to support a Nazi regime and a Holocaust in our own country, the relativist would be duty-bound to support the effort. It is to say that the Holocaust is just fine as long as there's a majority opinion. Under relativism, anything goes, even the Holocaust. As awful as these atrocities are, it is sometimes easy for us to put aside things that happened decades before we were born and not think too much about them. Let's drive this point a little closer to home. Moral relativism means it isn't really wrong to fire someone for being gay or for being Christian. Moral relativism means it isn't really wrong to treat or judge people differently based on their race or ethnicity. Moral relativism means it isn't wrong to pollute the living daylights out of the planet and leave the next generation to deal with it. Moral relativism means it isn't wrong to kill people who can't defend themselves. Moral relativism means it isn't wrong to massacre first graders at school. Moral relativism means it isn't wrong for a doctor to sexually abuse patients for decades. Moral relativism means it isn't wrong for a media mogul to require sex from employees as a condition of employment. Moral relativism means it isn't wrong for an acclaimed scientist to get a woman so drunk she won't remember anything and then rape her. Moral relativism means it isn't wrong for a man to walk into a synagogue and gun down 11 innocent people during their worship service. Moral relativism means it isn't really wrong for a police officer to kneel on a man's neck for more than 8 minutes, causing his death. Moral relativism means it isn't really wrong when mobs combine and wreak violence on people, property, or governments. Moral relativism necessarily requires horrifying conclusions. It brings with it unspeakable baggage. It can't even caveat this under, it's okay for consenting adults, since even that makes a moral claim. Each of us, if truly honest with ourselves, would have to admit that we believe most, hopefully all of the examples I've cited, are wrong. Really wrong. Horribly wrong. If you believe even one of the things I've mentioned is truly wrong, not just unfashionable, but genuinely wrong, you don't believe in moral relativism. But there is an allure to accept moral relativism, baggage and all, in order to avoid feeling guilty for wanting to do things that parents, principals, or pastors say people ought not to do. What a jaw-dropping exchange to accept any and all depravity in order to justify one's own appetites. If ever there was one, this is a deal with the devil. To summarize, under relativism, to each their own depravity. Moral relativism is growing in popularity. Its most powerful fuel is not a solid philosophical argument. Indeed, we've demonstrated here that relativism is not particularly well-grounded in reason or experience. No, it's principally fueled by something else. Relativism's secret sauce is that it tells people what they want to hear. There are people who want to be told that sleeping with anybody, anytime, anywhere is perfectly fine, and anyone who says otherwise is deluded or evil or both. There are people who want to be told that if you want it, you deserve it. We human beings are remarkably quick to believe something that we want to hear. And so, as a moral objectivist, I recognize that I have an uphill battle. I'm frequently telling people what they don't want to hear. If our goal is to find a theory which tells us what we want to hear, I can't compete with that. But if the objective is to discover truth, to understand things as they really are, then we have a clear, coherent argument that moral relativism is inconsistent with reason and experience. As an ethical guide, moral relativism decidedly doesn't deliver.